the Florida Writer Podcast, a discussion about writing and other things.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. And today I am lucky enough to be with Sonja Mongar. Sonja, welcome to the Florida Writer Podcast.
Yeah, thank you.
Could you give us a 60-second elevator pitch about who you are and what you write?
That's such a heavy question, right? So I just won in 2019 the Florida Writers Association Royal Palm Literary Award for fiction for my book, 2 Spoons of Bitter. So I have a novel out. I'm not a novelist, though, per se. I am a memoirist and a journalist. And I started that in the beginning because I was so committed to truth and fact. That was how it all started. So, jumping to a novel was really difficult. But I also do a lot of genealogical writing called autoethnographies. I have a diary that belongs to my great-great-grandmother when she was the 14-year-old daughter of a central Montana rancher in 1907. And I've done kind of artifact writing, autotopography, which is focusing on photographs to generate writing. I'm a songwriter. I am a journalist. I teach at the Western Connecticut State University low residency MFA program, primarily journalism and creative nonfiction. And I have 2-3 degrees in writing. 2 of them are in universities in Florida, so in creative nonfiction primarily.
Well, you are a very busy person.
Yeah, and I'm about to. There's a book going to be out soon called Ghostline, and it's a photography book. And when I was like 19 years old, I moved to Washington State, and I lived in a boxcar with my son and my husband then, and I worked for the railroad. I cooked for the crew and stuff like that. So he's right. His work is based on the deconstruction of the Milwaukee Road, which went bankrupt in the 1980s. And my story is going to be featured in that as well. So that's coming up.
Right. So you lived in a boxcar. Does that mean was the train moving?
Yeah, well, it was a camp. It was actually called a camp car. And it was converted for a living space. It was like the first tiny home. It predates all tiny homes. So it was about 50 by 80 length and width, the size of a boxcar, and it had a 6-minute shower, a water tank for a shower. It had no indoor plumbing, and there was no insulation because we lived in a very cold climate and very dusty, et cetera, et cetera. And that was just another adventure that I had in my very, I've had a lot of adventures like that.
Well, adventures are the stuff books are made out of.
Yeah, exactly. So I don't know if that was an elevator pitch or not, but there it is.
So you write in multiple genres.
Yes, absolutely.
So let's talk about genres real quickly. So, there's your basic genres, but then there's blended genres and tell me about genres.
Well, if you want to look at genres in an academic sense, there's only 4 genres. So there's creative nonfiction, fiction, plays, and poetry. That's it. So if you go to college, that's what you study. In publishing, there's a whole different range of publishing of genres as well. So if you're talking about canonic versus marketplace, it's hard to kind of overlap them. So what's happened lately, though, is that people aren't happy with staying within the boundaries of what we label genres as, and they're breaking out. And what I say is crossing the line. Like when I wrote my novel, it was based on a diary that I kept when I worked for people. I worked managing grants for people living with AIDS in a drug and alcohol rehab in Florida in the 1990s, when it was like this big epidemic and there was this huge crisis going on, and the agency was corrupt. There's all kinds of racism, homophobia stuff going on. And I was pretty young. I was pretty naive. I wasn't young. I was very naive. And I started keeping a diary. So it started there, but it took me 20 years to turn it into a novel. So that was the range. So what happened with fiction, I mean, I couldn't write the story in memoir. I tried it in journalism, like an expose. I tried it as a memoir, but I didn't want to be the protagonist. And finally, when I, like 20 years later, I was going through a huge, string of losses, including disability, with my health. I sat down and said, okay, I give up. I'm just going to try fiction with this story. And I always say that the story chooses the genre. It chooses its structure. So it didn't want to be a memoir. It didn't want to be journalism. And then what happened is everything unfolded. So what finally happened is I got permission and the freedom to actually tell the story that I wanted, but I could invent as well. I could create characters and things like that. So some of the genres that are popping up, like I noticed one of your previous interviewees said something, I can't remember her name, Jennifer, said something about autofiction. So autofiction is an autobiography written in a autobiographical form, but with some embellishment. And the example I'm going to use is Chelsea Girls by Eileen Miles. So the publisher calls this fiction. And she was a poet in the 1970s in New York City. And as you can imagine, she was wasted most of the time. And she didn't remember a lot of her story. She wanted to write her memoir. And she calls it autofiction, even though the publisher calls it fiction. And what she did to handle that is that she has big blocks of writing that has no punctuation, because there were moments in her life that she doesn't really remember everything. It's kind of foggy kind of thing. So, I mean, it points out the problem with memory. Memory is unreliable anyway. All dialogue is a lie. So when we say we're writing memoir, we're inventing, we're creating, and then when we go a step farther to creative nonfiction, which gives us the freedom to create these traditional plot lines and, resolutions and characters and things like that, which allows us to go to that, like Mary Carr's books, for instance. Then, I mean, it's all invention, really. I mean, you really can't say that memoir is 100% true, because 5 kids growing up in the same family are going to have 5 different versions of what their life was like. And so, memory is unreliable. Memory is symbolic. Anyway, the truth, I mean, whose truth? Those kinds of things. So these are all the arguments I had with myself going through those years, trying to decide, to make that jump to fiction. And so there's another type of, another category, which Homer Hickam, who was a NASA scientist, rocket scientist, wanted to write his memoir. And it's called Rocket Boys. And he grew up in West Virginia in the coal mining town. And he wanted to set it there. And he coined the phrase novoir, which is a fusion of novel and memoir, because he said parts of the story are so boring, I had to jazz it up. So he very, very consciously, adapted that story to be more, and it made into a movie. I can't remember the name of the movie, or the series or something. But there's another example of just creating a form that gives you permission to tell the story the way you want to tell it. And that's what happened to me. And what I find a lot with students now is that there's just all this pastiche going on with memoir writing. And, it could have fairy tales, it could have photographs, it could have poetry. I mean, there's a lot of fusion going on altogether. And I think that it's wonderful the way we're just breaking lines, because what it comes down to when you're writing, like when I wrote my novel, my worries about it was that, I couldn't go and interview the people for facts. Things had changed over time. I'd lost a lot touch with people. There was a confidentiality thing, because I worked with clients at an alcohol and drug rehab center. And is it my right to tell their story? That it was, those kinds of things were just muddling through my mind. And, because I was claiming agency for them, the whole, voice for the voiceless. That's a common thing people say, oh, I'm a voice for the voiceless. But, when it comes down to it, when we understand, personal stories, we understand we can't tell other people's stories, and call them our own. We can't claim agency for them. They have their story. I mean, I can't go back and ask each person what their story was now, because some of them are dead. A lot of them died of AIDS. And so, I mean, this is very political too. Like, the personal is political. I mean, what story do I have the right to write? And even when I was writing about my own family, when I did my thesis at UCF, I did my first thesis there. And, I wrote a memoir, and it alienated my whole family. Everybody was mad about how I represented, and it was my truth, of course, it was my truth, how I represented my family. And, my brothers didn't like me using their real names. And, there was all kinds of things that went on with that. And then, interestingly, and I tell this to my students too, 20 years later, I reread the memoir, and I didn't recognize it, because things change. Your perspective, your lens changes, your perspective changes. So this whole discussion about genre is just, kind of a moot point. It's for the purpose of marketplace, the purpose of publishing, of course, the agent is going to want to know, is this fiction or not? Or if it's not fiction, they're going to make it fiction, right? But that's the dilemma that we have as writers. And I just finished a thesis with a student recently, and she had all the same, as a memoir, and she had all the same issues, like, what should I leave in, what should I leave out, do I have permission to talk about this? There's a lot going on. So I would never suggest that a memoir writer use fiction. I never suggest that. But what I do say is that it's a palette, like, craft is a palette. It's like a painter's palette. It's got, hundreds of colors. And I look at writing and craft as, you just choose the colors that you need to tell the story. The story chooses its form. It could be poetry. It could be a podcast. It could be, a moth story, an oral story. It could be a recorded interview of your family. I mean, there's so many different ways to tell stories. You just choose the modality, and you choose the form, and you choose the craft. And that's kind of how I go about my own writing. It's a lot of the stuff I'm doing now is a lot of mishmash of things, artifacts, photographs, poetry, lyrics, all those things. So, as a professor of creative writing, having taught these genres for almost 20 years, I tell people, break the rules, do what you have to do to find the story. So I know that was a long answer. I don't know if I answered all the question.
Well, I love it. My mind is reeling with information right now. I'm like, oh boy, because I'm in the middle. I call myself a memoirist, and I write a lot of flash memoir. So it's my story in 500 words or less. So it's like maybe a 3-minute incident that I'll write, about leaving Starbucks and hopping into the wrong white car. Right. It's one of those stories. All the cars look alike. You open the door, there's somebody sitting in the car. We both scream at each other. Yeah. And, it's one of those things. It was a funny story. It happened. But at the same time, so that's like my flash memoir. So now I'm taking a lot of the stories that I have, and I'm putting them into my own memoir. Uh-huh. And, most of them they're short. They're longer than the 500 words, but each section is sort of standalone with a little mini lesson attached to each one. So it comes across as more inspirational, maybe shrouded in the memoir. But anyway, I'm like,
It sounds almost kind of like Chicken Soup for the Soul or something, kind of like a lessons in life or something.
It is a lot of lessons in life. And, we all have a story to tell. We all have interesting things that happen to us. It's whether or not we are willing to go in there, untangle them, share them. It's complicated. Some people are like, oh no, my life has been so plain. Why in the world would anyone think I'm special? And it's so,
there's a lot of barriers and obstacles to that, because people don't, it hasn't been safe to tell our stories. Like now we're able to tell stories that we couldn't tell 20 years ago, especially women. The other thing is we've been shut up and shut down. Women have been, this happens in, MFA programs, where, women are, sort of managed or oppressed by, expectations and social expectations and roles and things like that. I mean, there's nothing more frustrating. And for me, I've been trying to find people to exchange writing with, and nothing more frustrating for me than to have say a male writer read something I've written and then try to shut me down about something that I'm expressing. I mean, that happens a lot. And, you have to push through that. I mean, one of my favorite books right now is this one, the Melissa Fabus body work, because a lot of people are writing about trauma. A lot of people are writing about body dysmorphia. A lot of people are writing about, the Me Too stories and things like that. So, they shouldn't be shut down by, the limited expectations around them. You have to have courage to keep pushing through and think my story matters. I don't care if an agent knows it or a publisher knows it, my story matters. Like the story I wrote, the novel that I wrote that started as a diary. That story dogged me for 20 years until I finally wrote it. And it's like, oh my God, I got it out. And the thing is that it was way more autobiographical than I expected, because I focused on the Midwest as where the protagonist came from. And I focused on the culture shock of coming to the South. I focused on intergenerational violence I focused on, a caregiver, like a lot of therapists are, and et cetera, who sometimes need to be fixed worse than the patients they're taking care of, So there was a lot of autobiographical things in that respect, but most of the things didn't happen that way. And the characters are different and things like that. I even changed the name of the city, which was Jacksonville, Florida, where it took place. But I thought, I really need to make this more generic, because I don't want, I just wanted to shroud it in the invention that fiction allows us. That's what I want to say.
Do you think that with self-publishing growing at such a rapid rate that has helped to free up a lot of the stories?
Oh, absolutely. We are so in control of media now. I mean, we can do podcasts. We don't have to wait for NBC or ABC to give us a very, tap on the head with their magic wand. We can make films. We can make music. I mean, I'm an indie musician, and in the 90s in Florida, I mean, we were all over the place making our own indie albums, and the indie movement was huge. It's not so much now. I mean, maybe it is. I just don't know about it, but it's just that you can control, getting your voice out there. And the moth stories emerged, some time ago, and they are fabulous. And I've done projects with my students that are similar to that, the moth stories and things like that, and writing based on ancestral photographs and oral history. And it's really, really fascinating stuff. And they get their voice out there. And it's not like New York Times bestseller or blah, 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 but it still matters. It's still important. So, and you can have, my mom she interviewed her parents, and she has 2 tapes of their different stories of their life, and she transcribed them and she added things to that along with photographs. And, she's going to get a Library of Congress number, and we're going to print it for her, and it's going to be in the Library of Congress. You can have your story out there. It just I guess how it's out there is the thing that we always suffer over. Like my students constantly suffer over publishing. And it's like, forget about it. Write the story, just write the story. So, and since the publishing process was so grueling, the indie I don't know if I'll ever do it again, honestly. It was just so grueling and so expensive. And, I don't recommend that for anybody, but it was just, I just didn't have time to wait for somebody to pick up my book. I just didn't want to wait. So.
Wow. What a great conversation. I could go on and on and on about this. I have like a million more questions, and you probably have a whole day of things you need to do. Sonja Mongar, how can people get in touch with you? How could they discover more?
Well, my website is crashed, so you can't get hold of me there, but I'm on Facebook at Sonja Mongar. I think just type in my name, Sonja with a J. And also my email address is sonjamongar.author@gmail.com. So I should have my website up, hopefully maybe next week at sonjamongar.com. But, and if you Google me, you can find stuff that links back to me. So that's kind of how it works.
Well, Sonja, are you ready to switch to our rapid fire questions?
Oh, sure. I hope I got some good answers. Okay.
I'm going deep on this one. Okay. Do you have a favorite teaching moment?
I don't know. I think it's when the classes end and I just feel this whole loss, this horrible loss. I feel like I lose a bunch of friends at that. So that's my teaching moments at the end of the semester. That's my unfavoritist time, but the most poignant and emotional.
Do you have a favorite color?
Blue, because I love the blues too.
And what are you planning for this evening's activities?
Well, I just got a writing partner. I tried to start a writing group, and it narrowed down. I have one person. She's in Toronto, and I'm preparing my first story to send her for tomorrow. So that's what I'm doing. So I'll hopefully get a great, feedback, and I'll be able to send it off somewhere and get it published.
Well, Sonja Mongar, thank you so much for stopping by.
Thanks, Mario. I really appreciate this. Take care.
You have been listening to another edition of the Florida Writer Podcast with your host, Alison Nissen. Alison out. Woo. We're all done.
Sonja Mongar is a journalist, memoirist, novelist, songwriter, and cultural archaeologist photographer. She teaches in the Western Connecticut State Residency, MFA in Creative and Professional Writing School. Her novel, 2 Spoons of Bitter, won the 2019 Gold Royal Palm Literary Award for Fiction from the Florida Writers Association, as well as 2 other awards. SonjaMongar.com. SonjaMongar.com. Join us for a weekend jam-packed with networking opportunities, workshops, awards, book signings, a youth summit, and more at the Florida WriterCon 2022, October 28th through October 30th. The Florida Youth Summit, October 29th. Until next time.